To whom it may concern, the content of this video deals with the game scene in the first arc of the anime Sword Art Online. This is not pirated content and is more akin to a thought experiment on how the game could be better designed. Furthermore, you will also find that I have no clips nor pictures from the anime itself and will only refer to the characters, places, and other associated things by name. Along with shapes I've created using PowerPoint, I'll be using images from other sources. These images belong to their original owners/creators and are used for the sake of providing visuals for the discussion. To those watching, it would be in your best interest to watch the anime before continuing. You'll only find poor stand-ins here. Recently, I've heard how fair use has been disregarded lately for anime-related content, among other things. In light of this, I've gone out of my way to make sure this video can stay up for as long as possible so people may freely discuss this topic without the fear that an entity or even individual will come along and bully me to remove this video. I like anime-related content and will analyze anime every now and then as I would any other medium. This is merely a precaution to keep the hounds at bay, especially since I'm a small channel. Dare to claim this video before or after watching it, and I will bite back if I find the claim to be dubious. You have absolutely no right to silence me and others who fairly analyze and discuss media/content no matter what form it takes. To put this as bluntly as possible, good luck claiming this video. You've been warned. Give me all your coin, you minge. Huh? Nothing like the morning grind. Hello there. Oh, hang on. I need to switch my gear. Okay. Come on. Let's go. Okay, there's that. Boom. There we go. New year, new me. Hello there. I'm the Kali Crusader. For a highly popular anime, Sword Art Online has, to put it bluntly, a number of faults. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed the first arc of the first season as a guilty pleasure, but objectively it has flaws, and to me it could have been executed better. As for the second arc, I'm still having an internal debate on that one. Maybe one day I'll do a deep dive analysis of the first season of SAO, but today is not that day. This isn't a promise, by the way, this is just a maybe. As for the other arcs, I know about them, I've seen clips about them, but I haven't watched full episodes, so it would be unfair of me to give my thoughts on them. However, I'm not here to talk about all the story problems and whatnot. Well, maybe one from a certain point of view. What I'm here to discuss is the game from the first arc, which is also called Sword Art Online. Fancy that. For those who may not know, the first arc, also known as the Aincrad arc, begins with 10,000 players logging into the game, and they are ultimately trapped when they can't log back out. To get out, they have to beat all 100 levels of Aincrad. Therefore, the plot follows our protagonist Kirito in his quest to get back to the real world alongside a girl named Asuna and many others. However, there's a catch. If any of the players die in the game, they die for real, which is meant to establish the stakes. And this is where I think SAO the game, and by extension the first arc, fails. The stakes are broken, and I believe this stems from a problem. Well, maybe two problems if you factor in plot armor, but that's not the focus of this video. The game is meant to be a VR MMORPG, yet it fails to live up to the reality part. Now, I should come clean and say I have never played a VR game before, but I'm familiar with the concept of virtual reality. Also, I have played RPGs before, games such as The Witcher 3, Skyrim, Breath of the Wild, and whatnot. However, I am not an expert on gaming. I'm just your average guy who just so happens to like video games. Overall, this video should be taken with a grain of salt. These are just some thoughts I had about the gaming side of SAO and why I think it fails when it could have been something more. I just thought it would be interesting to share and discuss those thoughts with you. And as always, feel free to discuss the topic in the comments. Just be respectful to each other. In addition, I want to give a shout out to the channel Shadiversity. Some of the videos Shad has made looking at games and movies while trying to gauge how realistic they are inspired me to make this video. In fact, it's channels like his and many others that have inspired me to become a bit more active and vocal on YouTube. I may not always agree with them on certain things. Heck, even they don't always agree with each other, but such is life. It would be a sad world indeed if we didn't have different thoughts and views on certain things, and being free to discuss different things from different angles can oftentimes be eye-opening or enlightening. With that being said, I should mention that I'm looking at YouTube at least for now, as something more like a side hustle than a full-time career. With so many channels already out there who are far better than me, I feel safer and more financially stable having work outside of YouTube. Plus, I look more at making videos and content as a hobby like I do with my writing. To put it bluntly, I'm not here to make money. Even if I do make it big one day, that will never be my ambition. I'm just here to share my thoughts with you guys. Even so, the support is appreciated. So thanks. Anyways, let's get started. When it comes to media in general, I like to look at them all under the same set of lenses. They'll have their differences, but they do share some base elements. Anime is no different, and I don't hold it up on a pedestal. Nor will I make this channel an anime-only channel, despite my interest in the medium. When looking at SAO, the core concept of the first arc is an interesting one that has been explored in other places in various ways, but still interesting nonetheless. Taking a group of people and placing them in a dangerous situation opens the doors to many avenues. You could explore different themes of human nature and how people may act given the circumstances. Will players band together to survive, or will they turn on each other to fulfill their own selfish desires? Or you could just tell an interesting story with interesting characters your audience can get invested in. However, having something to say is one thing, putting your idea to paper is another thing entirely. And SAO definitely has problems with its execution, especially with the stakes. In the first episode, the players are told that they'll die if their HP ever hits 0. This should essentially set the stakes and make beating the game all the more dangerous and difficult, since you have to worry about taking damage and losing HP. Much like in the real world, the game essentially states you only get one chance at life. No respawns, no do-overs. However, this is what's told to us. What we see instead is something different. For instance, in episode 4, when Kirito faces a group of mid-level players, they slash and cut into him like crazy. However, his HP just resets because he's a high-level player and his recovery speed is too fast. As the abridged series puts it, his numbers are bigger. Another example is when Kirito is poisoned by this nutjob from Laughing Coffin and is near the brink of death. However, Asuna miraculously shows up with a healing crystal and a throwaway line to explain why she came. It seems to me that the worries centered around the HP meter are almost neglected, and any damage incurred is almost treated like a scratch. This may stem from Kirito's plot armor, but I do feel like the game mechanics should bear some of the blame as well. On top of that, having healing items on hand that can instantly restore your health does seem to cheapen how important it is to keep your HP up. To offer a comparison of what I'm trying to get at, let's talk about my adventures in Skyrim. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy playing Skyrim every now and then, but there usually comes a point where you essentially can't die unless you actively try to kill yourself. I remember one playthrough where I had maxed out my ebony armor and shield and increased my heavy armor skills to the point where bandits couldn't do spit to me. Also, if you have enough food and health potions, you can practically eat your way out of most situations. Trying to deal with a troll? Just pause, down a few health potions, and keep going. Dragon burning you to a crisp? Just pause, gobble up a few cheese wheels, and keep on trucking. This can even get so ridiculous to the point where even Alduin, the World Eater himself, is essentially a fly to you. I remember doing a whole bunch of other stuff that leveled up my character and gave me more power. By the time I went to Sovngarde for the final battle, Alduin didn't even stand a chance. I mean, I'm glad I completed the main quest and I enjoyed playing, but if I recall correctly, it only took me a few minutes to beat him. You'd think he'd put up more of a fight. Oh well, I guess. And that's the main problem that arises with a game like SAO. If you are a high-level player with max skills, you're essentially untouchable by players and monsters who are beneath you. And if you have a stacked inventory of healing items, you're pretty much set if you can navigate through the menu in time. But that's its own issue. On top of that, SAO offers safe zones where players can't take any damage no matter what they do. Sure, people can't beat the game if they don't leave the safe zones, but what's to stop people from just sticking around? Most people look for safety and shelter. It's one of the basic needs. When shelter is offered, people are most likely going to take it, and this is exactly what happens in the story. People start to abandon the idea of beating the game and decide to stay in safer places, giving up on the real world and deciding to make a new life in the virtual one. Granted, I can't blame them for wanting to stay. The real world can be a messy place sometimes. So the kind of stuff I mentioned can lessen the stakes and make the gameplay experience not as immersive. When a game keeps telling us that taking damage is bad because it may mean the difference between life and death, yet it's pretty much treated as a minor nuisance most of the time, Yeah, I think you've messed up somewhere. Heck, Kirito after the Gleam Eyes fight makes a quip like, "Hey Asuna, don't hug me so tight, I'll lose the last of my HP. Maybe he was trying to make light of the situation since Asuna was sad and whatnot, but still man, you are literally hanging on by a thread. You shouldn't be wasting time taking a crack at some dark humor. You should be chugging health potions like there's no tomorrow. So, is there a way we can enhance the realism and the believability of the game to make the game more challenging and immersive while also improving the stakes? I believe so. When I think of virtual reality, I think of something similar to the Matrix, a world that operates similar to our own despite being digital. Now, to be fair, the virtual reality games we have nowadays can come in many different forms, however, they are nowhere close to something like the Matrix. In addition, the first arc of SAO takes place between November 6, 2022 and November 7th, 2024. Sadly, unless a big tech company working with VR surprises us in the next few months, we are still far away from the kind of VR we see in the anime. Even so, we can still talk about the game as if the technology exists. Realistically speaking, though, I'm sure the price to make this game and to buy it would be astronomical, and programming this game would be a nightmare. That being said, this video won't focus on the financial or programming aspects of the game. I'm more interested in the gameplay. Anyways, I think the game relies too heavily on RPG elements. SAO to me is hamstringing itself when it could benefit more by being more like a virtual sandbox that just so happens to take place in a medieval fantasy. You can still have the same goal of beating 100 floors to escape Ironcrad. However, the game and by extension the story could benefit if you were to remove or lessen the RPG stuff and change some of the game elements. So, what would be some changes I would make if I was the game's creator? I know the story's already been written, so this is just a bit of a thought exercise to see if it would be possible to make SAO more realistic. I'm going to do my best to go from minor to bigger changes, but some of these changes could have drastic impacts no matter how big or how small they are, and I'm sure somebody else could come along one day and comment on my ideas or make their own suggestions. Again, these are just my thoughts, so do with them what you will. Real quick, I wanted to address a possible elephant in the room. I'm well aware that Mother's Basement has already made a video stating that SAO is a terrible game. In fact, I even watched the video while writing the script just to hear a different voice on the topic while I was researching. I don't watch his content regularly, since I'm not solely devoted to anime. However, I'm aware of some of his tweets and I've heard some things about him, things related to controversies and potential biases that have made me a bit skeptical of him and his work. Even so, I do think he makes some decent points in his videos, and it would be wrong of me not to acknowledge that even if we do have differing views and opinions. That being said, I want to expand on the discussion. Some of the things I bring up in this video might share some connections to some of the things he brought up. However, I don't plan on regurgitating exactly what he said. In fact, I think a big difference between the two of us is that he approaches the game as a bad game with bad RPG elements and mechanics, whereas I approach it as a bad game because it's not realistic enough. For instance, I disagree with his stance that players have to disrobe themselves to change their gear and clothing. In fact, I believe he's wrong about this. In his own video between 1201 to 1209, Kirito easily equips a new coat and possibly gloves with simple presses of a few buttons. There's no long gap of time between the transition from the old coat to the new, so I believe there's no disrobing or removal of the old coat. I believe it's a quick and simple change. I think Mother's Basement, between 1246 to 1303 in his video, simply wanted to take a stab at the fan service of the show and make a disingenuous point that equipping items in the game is too complicated. Granted, SAO's menu system, and by extension selecting the equipment you want to change into, is a bit silly, but we'll get to that. Furthermore, I think adding some complexity to changing your equipment would be beneficial for the realism, but again, we'll get to that. And while it's on my mind, I'll just go ahead and add that I'm completely fine with fan service, no matter what form it takes, be it physically stimulating or mentally stimulating through nostalgia, like seeing classic icons such as Luke Skywalker. However, for me to fully appreciate it, fan service needs to make sense on an objective level and not feel like it's being forced into a medium for the sake of being there or for the sake of jingling a set of keys. Sorry for the tangent, let's move on. Number 1. The menu. I wouldn't use the hand wave motion to open it. If your mind is what's plugged into the game, you should be able to summon a menu with your mind by thinking it. Instead of the standard menu graphic though, I would create something like a magic book or journal to fit in with the medieval fantasy world I'm trying to create. The magic book is only linked to you, so no one can steal it, and you can flip through the pages to see your quest, your notes, a floor map, in-game options, etc. However, if there is an inventory list, it would be just that, a list. You don't have to access your book to access your inventory to use and equip items. And this leads us to number 2, pouches, bags, and chests. I would implement a kind of inventory system based on what you are carrying and what you have stored away in, say, a home or an inn. This idea stems from the item management system you would find in some games like, say, the Resident Evil series. And this could impact how you plan your adventures or what you can loot. If you're going into a dungeon, you may want to pack more healing crystals and a teleport crystal in your pouch. If you're going hunting for some rabbits, you may want to leave some space open for the pelts and the meat you'll collect. Of course, I would implement ways where you could enhance your inventory space and carrying capacity. You could buy an enchanted pouch off of a vendor that allows you to carry more stuff. Or what if you bought or rented a pack animal that has a far greater carrying capacity than any pouch? However, it's more tedious to work with since you may become a bigger target for bandits, monsters, or even other players. Again, you would have to take this kind of stuff into consideration when planning your day of adventuring. You can also use the items that you have stored in your pouches more readily. If you need a healing crystal, just focus on one and reach down into your pouch. Or perhaps you have multiple pouches and each pouch has a dedicated item. One pouch for magically or digitally storing materials, another pouch for food, the list can go on. And for the sake of gaming convenience, the personal chest you store most of your items in is universal. No matter what inn, guild, hall, or home you go to, you'll have access to your chest. Kind of like that chest from The Witcher 3. If you do happen to marry someone or have a friend you trust, you can give them access to your chest as well. Also, I would keep the chest safe from being stolen from. Sure, this wouldn't allow players who want to be thieves to steal from your chest. However, I would allow your pouches and saddlebags to be stolen, and this could potentially cause a spike in banditry. This would make travel far more dangerous and would be a risky thing. It would also increase some of the stakes because you never know if you're going to be ambushed while on the road. Therefore, it would be wiser to travel together with a party or with a guild. Number 3, the leveling system. Chunk it. As mentioned before and what you possibly gleaned from my intro, the leveling system in SAO is honestly ridiculous and technically makes no sense. If your level and stats are so high that no one beneath you can do almost nothing to you, that's a pretty unbalanced game mechanic that can be easily exploited. And if there were no permadeath mechanic involved, it would make the game less fun and just turn it into an endless grind session where you would try to grind more to become more stronger so you can beat everybody else. Another thing that makes the leveling system pointless is the fact monsters and bosses are technically scaled to the level the players have. For instance, when Kirito and some of his friends go to face the Skull Reaper on floor 75, the monster is able to one-shot some of the players and kill them instantly, practically nullifying levels entirely. And some of the players were at a higher level since they were frontline players. At least that's what the Skull Reaper wiki page said, but even a wiki page should be taken with a grain of salt. Always double check. And leveling is made more pointless by the fact the game is an MMO. An entire guild of mid-level players using their combined strength and a good strategy should be able to take on tougher monsters or opponents, so why have a leveling system? Now, some people might argue that high-level players like Kirito can still suffer from the effects of underhanded and sneaky tactics like paralysis potions and poisons. We even see this in the anime where that nutjob I mentioned earlier poisons Kirito and he can't do anything but watch as this nutjob drives his blade into him. So you might argue the game is balanced if you play dirty. However, this actually compounds the issue. If high-level players can still fall victim to poisons and paralysis like any other player, why even have a leveling system to begin with? Number 4. Skills. Chunk 'em. According to my research, the skill system in SAO is a usage-based system. The level of a skill increases the more you use it. This is similar to how Skyrim functions with its skills. The more you sneak, the higher your sneak level will go. I can see some merit in this system. The only way you can get better at doing something is through practice and doing things repeatedly. For instance, cooking. Cooking requires a lot of experimentation and practice before you can get good at creating a decent meal. However, I do have a problem with the more unrealistic aspect aspects of this system. First off, it seems to me when you max out a skill in SAO, nothing appears to go wrong or there's no difficulty in using a skill. Going back to cooking, Asuna maxed out her cooking skills so she can easily cook a dish with a highly rare item with no hiccups. She can even create her own sauces easily. This to me seems rather unrealistic since there are so many factors that can go into cooking and anything can go wrong. It also just feels unfair that players who haven't maxed out their cooking skill can't make good meals with higher quality ingredients. I feel like all players should have access to the same ingredients and have the capacity to make whatever meals they want. However, their proficiency should be determined by how well they follow a recipe and the amount of practice and training they have cooking certain meals, not by how big their numbers are. To put this another way, a player who is good at making rabbit stew shouldn't be able to turn around and bake a perfect cake if they have no experience in baking cakes. They need to learn how to bake too. Secondly, I feel like skills would limit the playstyles and wouldn't allow for experimentation. For instance, if you wanted to sneak into a high-level enemy outpost but the only skills you've maxed out is mostly combat skills, you've essentially locked yourself out from the sneak option. You could grind and try to bring your sneak skill up, but I'm sure most players probably wouldn't want to do that. Now, someone could argue that if you're in a party with someone who has maxed out their sneak skill, you should be fine. After all, that's how RPGs should be played, right? You have people who slot into certain roles and that's that. Sure, but being stuck in only one role doesn't seem fun to me. Where's the freedom? Besides, what happens if that party member with a high sneak skill is sick or is taken out? What do you do then? This issue includes the whole business of allowing only certain players to have unique skills like dual wielding. I have no problem with players having to work hard to achieve a rare or unique skill. However, it becomes an issue when only one player gets to use a unique skill and everyone else is excluded from attaining that skill while that other player is still alive. Oh, you want to dual wield, huh? Well, boo-hoo, your reaction time wasn't good enough and Kirito beat you to the punch. What if Asuna could dual wield and use a dagger or sword breaker with her side sword? Yes, I know they call it a rapier, but I believe it's more of a side sword given the width of the blade. Still, what if she could? I think she would be more effective as a fighter if she could do that. Sorry, I need to correct myself. Recently, I looked into the unique skills on the wiki, and apparently players are still allowed to dual wield and equip two weapons. They just can't use the dual wielding skill that grants the players the abilities to use the sword skills needed to boost attack damage. Even so, this is still an unfair system, and sword skills that boost attack damage should be taken away as well for reasons I hope you will pick up on when we reach number 7 on the list. In general, the unique skills thing is just ridiculous. Heathcliff having access to the unique skill of being able to freely switch between offense and defense with his sword and shield and being allowed to attack with his shield is mind-bogglingly dumb. Players who use weapons and shields should be allowed to freely switch between offense and defense and be allowed to attack with their shield too. For those that might argue that shield users would then be OP in the game, I would slightly agree with you. There are advantages of using a shield in combat. Even so, I believe there are ways to defeat shield users. It would just take a matter of preparation and training to be ready to combat them. Number 5. Equipment and training. What can replace the leveling system and skills? For starters, you could have a system where the equipment you equip determines your stats. This would be somewhat similar to what's depicted in Breath of the Wild. If you want to play a little bit more stealthily and sneak up on opponents, you could equip armor or clothing that doesn't make a lot of noise and helps you blend in with the shadows. If you're about to head into a big fight and want more protection, you could opt for plate armor that provides more protection. However, if you wear something like a closed helmet, your visibility may be reduced. As for equipping new gear, I believe it would be an interesting mechanic if you had to physically remove your armor and clothes to change. This would mean you would have to plan your adventures more carefully and decide what armor and clothing you want to wear before heading out. You could potentially change your gear if you manage to find a safe place to change, like behind a bush or in a cave. However, you have to have enough space in your pouches or your bags to store your extra gear. As for weaponry, the weapons you use have their own kinds of stats based on how they would be used realistically. For instance, players with falchions or falchion-like weapons would have greater slashing damage and would be able to easily deal with enemies wearing gambesons. Against plate armor, not so much, and you might have to rely on blunt weapons like warhammers or maces. And I think it would be a good idea if players could carry a secondary weapon they can switch switch to if needed. Furthermore, I would also have more ranged weaponry in the game. There are like these little throwing spikes, but they don't hold a candle to something like a bow or crossbow. I feel like ranged weaponry would be massive game changers in that they would be a great boon or a great threat to players, and you would have to plan accordingly. Again, adding to the stakes because you never know when you might get sniped. I sort of brought this up when I was discussing skills, but I think training and practice without a skill leveling system would be good for the game. Again, take cooking as an example. You would have to practice making certain meals to become proficient in making said meals. Even so, things could happen that might ruin the meals. You might forget to add a certain spice, the heat in the oven might not be right. Who knows? Anything can happen. For combat, I believe it would be best if you implemented something like a school system where players could go to any school they wanted for an hour or for a day and train under an NPC master. Players could practice their archery skills, do some workouts, learn how to actually spar with swords, and so much more. By doing so, they can actually learn real techniques and apply them in combat. Also, a player's proficiency in combat isn't determined by levels or the hours they've put into training, but by how well they've trained. An argument I could potentially see arising from this is that players who have a background in martial arts, especially in HEMA or something similar, would potentially have an advantage over average players who don't, which I definitely think could be an issue. With that being said, I would say that SAO would become a rather exclusive game similar to Dark Souls in terms of its difficulty. It won't be an easy game and you would have to train rigorously to ensure your survival. However, I don't see the problem with difficult or challenging games. It can actually make things more rewarding knowing that you worked hard to achieve something like beating a difficult boss or opponent. In addition, new playstyles could be introduced. If you're a player who isn't on par with a martial artist, you might play with a group more, or you may play more sneakily. You may even fight dirty. Some might say that this would be dishonorable, but the goal of SAO is to clear the 100 floors and get out alive. I think honor would be the last thing on some people's minds, especially when they're trying to survive. Number 6. Crafting. I'm pretty sure crafting is already a thing in SAO since you have blacksmith players like Lisbeth who make weapons. However, I'd like to expand on this idea of crafting so that players could potentially do their own crafting, and I'm not talking about gathering materials and pressing a button to automatically craft something. I'm talking about physically crafting something and putting it together with your own two hands, or with tools. You can still have dedicated blacksmiths or carpenters, but what if players could craft certain items while out and about on their adventures? Maybe players can craft traps to hunt game or even other players. Maybe players can freely craft their own houses or maybe even their own castles if they have the right resources and equipment. Of course, for big projects like that, you could hire NPCs or enlist other players to help you. Now, I would implement rules or codes into the programming of the game that prevents players from using resources to make things like guns, cannons, or gunpowder. This isn't to say you can't have guns or gunpowder in a medieval fantasy as long as the world building makes sense. Gunpowder and guns were technically introduced in Europe during the medieval period. However, I believe guns and gunpowder would conflict with the kind of fantasy world SAO is trying to be. Number 7. Health. I will admit that the HP meter system does have merit, but I would alter it just a tad. First, I wouldn't have players lose points based on the attack damage of the weapon. I would have it be more in line with the severity of the wound as well as the placement of the attack. For instance, an arrow to the head would probably result in death if there's severe damage, but that's not to say an arrow to the face is always an instant kill. Henry V, for instance, survived an arrow to the face. Also, the loss of a limb is going to be more life-threatening than a stab to something like the foot. Could you imagine dying if someone just repeatedly stabbed your toes? That would be stupid. Secondly, I wouldn't let players have automatic health regeneration. Instead, if you are damaged or bleeding, you would have to use healing items like bandages or healing crystals to heal yourself up and patch yourself up. Bandages would be the standard healing implement, and crystals would be the most effective healing item. However, I would make crystals rare or hard to get, and they can't fully heal you automatically. Maybe they can heal you over time. If you get an infection or get poisoned, you have to use medicine and bed rest until your stats are back to normal. I wouldn't mind implementing diseases, even life-threatening ones, into the game as well, but that might be hard to program and apply to the game. Therefore, just a standard infection that goes away with time and medicine is fine, but it should have an impact on your stats. For instance, if you have muscle aches, maybe you can't use weapons for an extended period of time and have to rest more. From what I understand, SAO can simulate pain. If pain can be simulated, I think muscle aches can be simulated too. Now, if someone lost a hand or limb and managed to patch up their wound in time, I think I would implement a system where maybe like 3 days in bed will restore your lost limbs. Or you could visit a magic fountain in a town and drink the water to restore yourself. This doesn't include decapitations, by the way. You're dead if you lose your head. Sorry, Ned. Number 8. Safe zones. I honestly had a debate with myself on this, deciding whether to keep safe zones or not. I can definitely see the merits of having a safe zone where you can't take any damage and your HP won't drop. However, this does open the door to potential exploits and people not wanting to leave them, therefore they'll never beat the game. In light of this, I think the best thing to do is to have a system where there are levels of safety. For instance, green zones can include guild halls, schools, homes, places of business, and inns. In these places, you can't take any damage whatsoever. Yellow zones can include cities or fairly large towns. You can take damage, however these places are more secure. High stone walls and gatehouses would make these places far less likely to be raided by a large force of monsters or an aggressive guild of players. They can still be attacked and a siege could occur. Also, there could be NPCs in the form of soldiers or a police force that keep an eye out for criminal activity. Now, you could still get away with crimes if you bribe the NPCs or do something out of their line of sight. Orange zones can be areas that are less secure than yellow zones and are more open to danger. These areas can include roads and small villages. Maybe there are NPC patrols but they aren't as numerous, or they happen by players less frequently. Red zones can include dungeons, boss areas, and practically everywhere else. You are essentially on your own. Black zones can be a thing as well, and death is almost certain if you enter these areas. It's still possible to escape, but your chances are slim. This can include areas like lava flows or pits of tar. The possibilities are endless. So there you have it. Those are some of the ideas I would use to enhance the realism of SAO and hopefully increase the stakes. Even so, there would be a lot more things to fix and tweak story-wise, but that's not important right now. There may be a few things that I missed or things that can be improved upon, so if you have something to share, leave a comment and open a discussion with everyone. Don't worry too much about the financial costs or the programming side of things. Again, this is just a bit of a thought exercise. That's all I have to say. Thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you again. Until then, farewell and take care everyone.